This is Tushar Kole. In this session, we are going to discuss about the Python unit test. The Python unit test is a framework to do the unit testing. It is similar to Java JUnit, or it's inspired by that. So in this session, I'm going to discuss about the unit test, its different functionality, and I'll take a test-driven approach, which means that first I'll write a test case, and then I'll write down the code. When I write the test case without the code, test will fail. Write the code in order to fix it. So that's how I'm going to do it. So let's move on. So in Python unit test, there are different components which we'll cover here. For example, asserts. What are asserts? Basically, when you are going to test, you're going to compare some value for which your code should return with respect to your expected values. So when you are trying to match that, that's what we will do with the asserts. For example, there are assert equals. Assert equals takes two parameters. One will take from your code, and the second one is the actual value, and which will compare whether both of them are correct or wrong. Similarly, there are assert true, assert false. The list of asserts which we'll see later on. Okay. Then there is something called setup. So setup is a function, built-in function. Basically, it will be called before every test cases, and that test cases that we can do some preparatory work. For example, creating an object and all. Okay, creating an object, creating a variable, on this setup activity it will do. There is also something called setup classes, which will be called only once per class, whereas setup will be called before every test case. Anyway, we'll see all of this. Let's move on. Similar to setup, there is teardown, and as well as there is teardown class. So it does just the opposite. If you want to release some variables, if you want to undo something after every test cases, you can use this teardown. And there is exception. Basically, let's say your code is raising some exception and you want to validate that whether your code is raising the correct exceptions or not. That's why we can use exception or something called assert raises. Then skipping test. Let's say you want to skip the test. Okay, you have written so many test cases and don't want to run everything, you want to skip some special test cases, you can do that. Okay. Then there is something called mocking. So mocking is really great functionality. Basically, mocking says that, let's say your code requires something else from some other website, and some other website may be down. Now, ideally, when you are running the test cases, you should not be connecting to external resources all the time. Ideally, every such cases, you want to do a mocking so that you want to test just your part of the code. You don't care whether other side is working or not. That's a mocking. Then there is also something called test suite. So test suite is a way to group your test cases. You have many test cases and you want to logically group depending on different functionalities. Then you can make use of test suite. Okay, for our use cases, what we will do, we are going to take two separate type of examples. First, we want to test some functions. We'll have our own module. In our own module, we'll first write few functions. We'll just write few string functions to demonstrate how this tool is applicable for any complex functional programming. Okay, so first one, we'll create a new function called reverse string. So basically that will just reverse the string as the name suggests. Then we'll create another concat string that will just concatenate two strings, and then we'll create another function called split string that will take the sentence, let's say, and it will split based on the spaces. Then now we will also create a class. We'll create a simple employee class, and we'll have some attributes in this class as well as some methods. So this class is going to have an attribute like name, ID, age, salary. And then we'll create some method, the class method, which will depend, for example, if the employee is adult or not. Let's assume that all age employees are there. Then we'll create another function to set ID, which will set the employee ID. Then we'll create another function to get the employee salary. This employee salary, we'll assume that we'll get it from some external server. Okay, so here are the list of asserts which I mentioned. Here you see there are assert equals, which checks whether A is equal to B. Assert not equal checks A not is equal to B, so on, so forth. Okay, you see assert is not none. For example, this one it says x is not null. So yeah, these are the list of asserts. There are many more actually. All of them are available in Python documentation. Please check out the documentation. Now let's move on to our code. Okay. Here I have opened Sublime Text. In this Sublime Text, I have created two Python files. One is the test module, which I'll write the test cases, and then I have the main module where I'll write my main program. So as I told you that first I'll write down the test cases which should fail, and then I'll write down the code to fix it. So in order to run the unit test, first what you have to do, you have to just import unit test. So you have to run the import unit test. You have to import unit test. Then we also have to import your main module, because that's where your code is going to be. Okay, so I've just done the imported. I've just done the necessary import. Now let's say I'm just going to do, I'll create a new test cases for string functions which I discussed just now. So let's say that I name it as, I create a new class and name it as string unit test. Okay. Now this class should be inherited from the unit test cases. So this is how you have to create a class before you write down the test cases. Now you can define your test cases. You can start defining your test cases. Let's say first test case I want to define is test reverse. And by that, every time you create a test case, it has to be with name test. It has to be started with the name test. It should be test with lowercase. Okay, then I'm just writing underscore. This underscore is not mandatory, but test has to be there. Without that, test will not work. Okay, now let's see that we are creating this test case. Okay, then what we'll do is let's say I'm just doing a self dot assert equal, then let's say main module dot, let's say reverse string. Let's say I'll give ABCD, and the reverse of ABCD should be TCPA. So the reverse string in the main module is not yet defined, so it's definitely going to fail. Okay, before you run this as a test case, you have to do something. You have to basically write down a couple of lines of code, okay, which says something like that. If name is equal to main, name, it should be like this. If underscore name underscore equal to underscore main underscore, what it is telling, if this is the main program, then what you will do is you will call unit test dot main. So if you do that, then it's going to call your test cases. Okay, so now you see it just ran one test cases and it says it has failed. And why it failed? Because main module has no attribute called reverse string, which is correct. So what we'll do is we'll just create this function here in the main module. Okay, we'll just define this reverse string, and under reverse string we'll take a string. Let's say I'll take my string as argument, and I'll just return my string. This will do the reverse because this is the first index, this is slicing, first index, second index, and -1 in the reverse order. So that should do the job. Let's run it again. Now you see one test ran one test and test was successful. Now let's write on the next test case. Let's say I want to define test underscore concat string. Okay, so as usual I'll write down the self, then I'll do self dot assert equals, I'll do main module dot, this time it will be concat string. Okay, now let's see that my function name is main module dot concat string. In that concat string should take two arguments. Okay, let's say it will take to real value. Okay, let's say I'll give my name, and after concatenation it should be just like that. It should concat. Okay, so if we run it again, this will fail because to run two tests failed, error 1. So I have to define this function. So I'll just go to this main module. Here I'll define this function concat string. Let's say I'll say string 1 and string 2. Okay, and I'll just return string 1 plus string 2. Okay, that should do our job. Let's run it. Yeah, so it has executed. Moving on, let's do the next run, next test cases. Let's say define test. I want to create this split, test split. Okay, that should be enough. Test split, or I would say test split string. Now let's take the self. Then what I do is I do the similar self dot assert equals, then main module dot, let's say split steer. That's going to be our function. Okay, in this function I'll pass the, let's say test. Okay, so once I split it, this should be equal to an list, and the first element should be test, second element should be string. So if I run it, then it's gonna fail. Let's create this in the main module. Go def split string self, and not self, sorry. So this should take my string. Under my string, basically you're just going to return my string dot split. Okay, that should do our job. Let's run it. Assert equals list differ test string test. Okay, got it. There's a spelling mistake. Yeah. Okay, now let's try to understand a few other things. Let's say I want to check under what order these test cases are executing. Let's say I would expect, because I have defined my test cases in this order, I would expect they would be calling in the same order. But let's check if this is working or not. So what I would do, I just print 1, 2 and 3. So I would expect it should print 1, 2, 3 in the order. But you see, first printed 2, then 1, then 3. If I run it again, so it's again on the same order. So what's going on here is basically these test cases are sorted by alphabetical order. Test underscore is common for all of the test cases. Then the next, if you sort this as alphabetical order, first comes C, then comes R, and then comes S. That's why this is become first, this becomes second, and this becomes third. So yeah, it doesn't depend, test case execution order does not depend on your test case the way you have defined. It depends on the alphabetical order. Keep that in mind. Okay, now let's say I want to skip some test here. Okay, let's say I want to skip this test case number 2. How can I do it? So how can I do it is basically, okay, so here you do like that, Unittest dot skip, then you can add some comments. Okay, So if we run it now, you see it says run 3 tests and skipped once. Okay, so this is how you can skip the test very easily. Okay, now in the same line, I also want to test the exception. Okay, let's say you have a function, that function raise an error. Okay, before that, let me try to run the test cases first. So let's say I define another test cases. Okay, my test case is like this: define test. In this test error, write self. Then under this, basically syntax is like that. You can do with dot assert error, assert raises. Now let's say I want to test something like value error. Then let's say you have main module dot raise error. Let's say you have a function called raise error. I know that function doesn't exist, so this test case will fail, but we're just going to define in a bit. Okay, so obviously it says main module has no attribute called raise error, so let's define this function here. Just say define raise error. Then so I'm just testing value error. What we can do is we can just say raise value error. Yeah, that's it. Yeah, so that has executed it. Okay, now moving on, let's create a new class called employee, and under employee I'm going to create a new test cases for employee. So in order to separate it, let me create a new class for test. Okay, so this, let's say that this is going to be employee test cases or employee unit test. Okay, let's say I'll create some spaces here. Let's say I'll do class employee unit test. Okay, now let's do unit test dot test cases as usual. Then what I'm gonna do is, so here let's say I want to check the name of the employee. Okay, so I'll just first create a test case def. Okay, before that let me first create the employee class here. Okay, so it's not mandatory, but I'll just create the class, empty class here. Class employee. Okay, under class employee, that's it. Okay, so I just defined the class employee. Let me also define the init method, init underscore init underscore. Under that, let's say init takes self and it takes first name. By the way, if you are not familiar with this syntax, I have another video for class and object. Please watch that. But okay, so I just define this init method. Then let's say I've created some instant variable or attributes. Self.appname is equal to appname. Self.lname is equal to lname. Okay, and then let's say I'm defining another class called name, which is the first name and last name by space. Okay, I can define a string. Then under that string I can define like appname. Okay, so I have defined a first name, last name and lname. So first test case, what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a employee test name object name. Okay, so I just define a test name, let's say employee. Okay, under this will be self, and here what I have to do, I have to create an employee instance basically. Okay, let's say emp1 is equal to main module dot employee. Okay, main module dot employee. Here let me create the name. Okay, so I'm just passing first name and last name. So next what I'll do is I'll create an assert. Okay, self dot assert equal Now I have this employee1 object, then I'll just access its name, and this name should be Tushar plus colon, because that's what we have defined. Now let's test this. So it is working fine. Okay, so this time we have just first written the class and then did the test. Okay, now let's say I want to do another test cases. Okay, I want to check whether the employee is adult or not. Okay, so how we can do it? Let's say I'll have to do similar thing, test employee adult. Let's say I'll check self. Similarly, I'll have to create an employee object. I have to first create an employee object, but in this time what I would do, I would just pass another variable, that's the age. Let's say age is 30, and we'll have to fix the employee code. I'll do it just in a bit. Now let's say self dot assert equals, or okay, this time we'll do assert true. Okay, assert true, then it will be employee1 dot adult. So this will be a new attribute which we have not defined yet. So if I run it, this is definitely going to fail. So it failed. Now what we'll do is, first in our init method we have to create another variable. Okay, that is age, another attribute. Age is equal to 20. Let's say this is the default age. Now here what you do, you define self dot age is equal to age. Okay, so I've just defined it. Now what I'll have to define another method called is adult, and first argument should be self, and what it would return, that self dot age greater than equal to 18. Okay, now if I run this test cases, let's see what happened. Self object has no attribute code. Okay, it's not going to be adult, it's going to be is adult, and then the function. Yeah, now it is working fine. So basically what I've done, I've just added a new attribute for age, and I've defined another method is adult, and that's returning true or false. So for example, in this case, because the age was 30, so that's why it returns as true. Okay, now let's say let's say I'm creating another employee, okay, whose age is 16. Okay, let's say Kishore Paul. Okay, his age is 16. So in that case, what I can do, I can write another assert. Now in this case, it should be just the opposite. Okay, because I expect that it will be false. So just do assert false, then call employee2. Okay, sorry, this is going to be employee2 dot is adult. Okay, call this function, then execute. Now see, it is also working. So definitely if you give this age 40, let's say, then it will fail. Okay, now let's say I want to create another module which will set the employee ID. I want to create another function which will set the employee ID. So how we can do it? Let's say I define a new test case. Let me add some more spaces here. Test employee ID. Here what I'll do is I'll even create a new employee. Okay, under this new employee, what I would do is I just do self assert equals, I'll do employee1 dot age equal to 6. Let's say 6, some value we are setting. So what we would do is basically here employee1 dot set set id 6. Now employee1 dot set id, this is not defined, so if I run it, this is going to fail. Yeah, it's failing. So let's first define it. Okay, I'll just go here. I'll define a new method called def set id. Okay, it will take id as a parameter, and then you are defining self dot id is equal to id. So I have defined this function. Now if I just run it, here the first parameter has to be self. Okay, so it did work. So okay, now you see, you have noticed one thing. For every method I'm defining a new employee object, employee1, employee2 objects. So this is really difficult to maintain. We have to repetitively do this same code. So in order to handle that, now we can make use of this setup class. So setup class definition is very simple. You just have to call this set up self. Under this setup, you can basically define your employee1, employee2, all the objects. Okay, so let's say I'm defining this employee1. This should be a attribute value. Okay, let's define self.employee1 is equal to this, then self.employee2 is equal to this, so that I don't have to do it inside the function. Okay, now I can remove these things. Now instead of employee1.name, so I have to call it as self.employee1. Okay, and remove the spaces. This is going to be self.employee1. This is going to be self.employee2, and here again let's do like self. This set id, I could do it inside setup method, but let me do it here because I'm going to do it only one time. Okay, and then self.employee1.id is equal to 6. Let's run it. So all the test cases have passed again. Okay, there's no issue at all. Only thing I have done is, that's because this setup method is being called before calling the every test cases. Now let's check one thing. I want to test one thing. I'll just add a print statement here in the set. Okay, just say star setup. Okay, if I just run it, you see the setup is being called before every test cases. It has called 3 times because 3 test cases here, that's why it is called 3 times. So that means setup is going to be called before execution of every test cases. Similarly, I can define another function called tear down. Tear down takes the same argument, self. Here what I would do is, let's say I have created these 2 employee objects, I want to remove them. You can use this with this command. Okay, self dot employee1, and do it in the same line, self.employee2. Okay, now if you want to also see how many times tear down is being called, you can write a print statement. So you see setup test case, tear down, setup test case, that's the order it's going to call. Now as I said, there is another special tear down method. It's called another tear down class method, which will be called only once per class. And what is the syntax for this thing is, basically this is something called class. There is something called class method. You have to do a class method annotation in the class method. Then you define this setup. It should be set up class. Then use this CLS. Then let's say in this will be called only once per class, no matter how many test cases you have added. And this is useful for expensive operation like database, creating database connection, etc. So we don't have any database. Let's mimic that. We'll just print that. Okay, let's just create DB connection. Okay, and similarly as you can guess, there will be another method called teardown, class method called teardown. Okay, let's just run it. Let's just run it as it now. Now you see, create DB connection. That means first it is calling the setup class method, then it is calling setup teardown. Now, similarly, we have to define another class method called teardown class, and that definition is teardown class CLS, and then let's say just print. Let's assume that you are releasing the database connection. Okay, now let's execute it. Now you see, it first called create database connection, setup teardown, release database connection. Okay, we'll have to see how to do the mocking. Let's say I want to get the employee salary, and employee salary is private, it's not available with the current object. You have to get the employee salary from some other website. So in order to do that test, what I would do is first we have to do something like mocking here. Okay, in order to do the mocking, we have to import something like patch. Okay, so what we have to do is you can import Unittest dot mock from Unittest.mock import patch. I'm going to finish with a couple more concepts. Let's say I want to test the mock. How we can do it? Let's create a new test called test salary. Okay, so let's take self, and here what we can do is, here our statement will be like with patch. Then what we want to patch is basically what we want to mock. This is going to be request dot get as mocked, get as mocked get. Then let's say mocked get dot return value. That we are mocking as return value for this function, return value dot result equal to, let's say 50, equal to 50. Okay. Next what we want to do is, self dot assert equals, here once we have got it, now basically you want to call self dot employee one dot get salary. Of course this function doesn't exist, we will have to create this function, but yeah, once we create this function, that should return the value of 50 which we have set it here. Okay, and that should work. If I run it, obviously it's going to fail, so let me come here and let me create this function. Okay, so what you can do is, let's create this function just like that. We'll create a new function here under get salary. I can say def get salary self, under self, let me create some more space here, self, let's say response is equal to, let's say request, this should be request, I need to import request, okay. So here what we have to do, request dot get. Now let's say I have a URL. Okay, my URL will be something like this. So I have a h string, and here this is called ticket.net employee self.id. So if id is 5, then it will be employee /5 salary. That will be your URL. Okay, and then what you want to return is, you want to return response dot result. Let's say your response is coming with a result variable, and that value is the salary value. Okay, once I'm done with that, I should be able to run this test. Okay, employee object has no attribute called id. Okay, got it. So here what you have to do is, you have to set the id. So remember that we have initialized this employee one, but we have not set id yet. We'll just set id is equal to 5, let's say. Okay, so there should be self.employee1.set id. Yeah, now it did work. So basically this is how you can mock an URL. Now you can also validate whether the mocking is actually calling the right URL. So what you can do it, you can just call something like mocked get. You can call something like assert called with. Okay, it will be something like this. And because I have set the ID as 5, then here I am passing it 5, and even that assert also should work. See, it's working. Yeah. Now just one final thing I would like to show it is called the create shoot. Okay, let's say now I have a 2 sets of class, and then every shoot you can add more than one class into it and to group it. Right now it is running everything. It's running all the test cases together. Let's say I don't want to run, I want to run only employee class or something. And how I can do it, I can do something like create shoot. Okay, so let me create a function. Okay, let me create a function just like that. Def, this is string shoot. Okay, what this function will do, this function will create a shoot and return that. Shoot is equal to Unittest dot test shoot. Okay, so now once the shoot object is created, you can add test. You can just do like add test. Under this you just get like Unittest dot make, that's the syntax, make shoot. Under make shoot you pass the class you want to create. This is our class. Okay, string Unittest, you pass this class. Okay, so that way you can create this function, and then you must return this shoot. Similarly for the other class, I'll just copy it. Let's say I'll name it as employee shoot, and just employee shoot. Okay, here as you can guess I'll use this class. Okay, so I've done. Now once I've done that, now let's figure out how we can run this one particular shoot. Okay, so in order to run it, there is something called test runner, Unittest text test runner. So you can do it like this: runner is equal to Unittest dot text test runner. Okay, then just say runner dot run. This is what you want to run. Let's say you want to run first string shoot. Okay, just call this function string shoot. Okay, now if you run it, okay, so let me comment this because this one is anyway running all the unit test. Okay, what you can do, let's comment this out. This, yeah, now you see it's just running the first test case with 4 tests. Okay, the string test. Now let's say you want to run the other shoot. What you can do, you can just copy this exactly same, comment this out, copy employee shoot. Okay, if you want to run the other class, other test cases. So yeah, I think that's it for today's session. Thanks for watching. If you like my video, please consider subscribing to my channel. Please also share with your friends, and please also like and hit the bell icon. Thanks for watching.